and it's my pleasure to welcome you all at this panel discussion on environmental sustainability with a focus on climate change and solutions. In recent years, there has been a growing awareness of the urgent need to address climate change, and we have seen an increasing number of initiatives aimed at promoting sustainability. This panel brings together a diverse group of experts who share their insights and perspectives on what constitutes climate solutions and the steps needed for the mitigation goal. So we are fortunate to have Professor Scott Frickel with us today as the moderator. Professor Frickel is a highly respected environmental sociologist with extensive experiences in environmental sociology and the power-knowledge relations. He will be facilitating and guiding us through a thoughtful conversation. Please join me in welcoming Professor Frickel. And so I'm confident that this panel will be an informative and engaging discussion. I look forward to hearing the exchange of ideas from our esteemed panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let's get started.
Thank you very much for the introduction and welcome everybody to our panel on hot planet, cool solutions, narrating a climate adventure. I'm looking forward to a hot, cool discussion. So one of the things that I'm very interested in sort of pursuing in the next 75 minutes or so is a conversation about how different disciplinary and professional perspectives may or may not converge around questions of climate solutions and how we narrate those solutions to broader general audiences and expert audiences. And I think this is a really interesting panel to explore these ideas. We have with us today someone who represents the field of climate governance and finance, someone who works in the field of climate ethics and climate science and science policy, an artist who works on climate change and nature, and a communications and critical media studies expert who also focuses on climate politics, climate movements of various sorts. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to briefly introduce yourselves to the audience, institution affiliation, a little bit about your disciplinary background, I think, to get us started. Rishikesh, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the invitation to join all of you here today. My name is Rishikesh Bhandary, and I work at Boston University, where I manage a research group called the Global Economic Governance Initiative. My disciplinary background is in international affairs, and so I approach the questions of climate change very much from an international affairs lens, which is sort of a hybrid of international law, some political economy, some political science. And the questions that I've been interested in is around the financing aspect. How can we think about international cooperation in terms of the necessary financing that's required to enable countries to shift to a low carbon transition? So I think about questions of climate governance around the financing arrangements that need to be put in place so that countries can make the shift that they need to towards a low carbon future. Thanks.
Hanna?
Hi everyone. First of all, thank you so much for the organizers for the invitation to be here and for fellow panelists and all of you who are here. It's really great to have this opportunity to talk with you all. And so my name is Hanna Morris, and I am an assistant professor at the School of the Environment at the University of Toronto. So I have a disciplinary background in communication, and I am in an environmental studies school and department. And so I focus on climate change communication and really bring in a perspective in terms of thinking about how media and different discourses conceive of and think of and define and make sense of climate change, and then how these different representations then shape proposed responses to the climate crisis. So in particular, I'm thinking through too how climate justice and climate justice activists are represented and portrayed in mainstream media, and how activists are contesting and building different representations through their own constructions of different narratives in media, and using social media in particular in really creative ways to try and build a transnational movement. So I'm looking forward again to this conversation, and thank you for all being here.
Okay, hello, everybody. Delighted to talk to a foreign crowd. I always learn something from people in other countries. My discipline is deeply interdisciplinary. I'm a lawyer, philosophy, engineering degree. When I talk, people fail to get, if you don't look at climate change from an interdisciplinary point of view, you'll get it wrong, because it's really different from air pollution. And we have a terrible problem in the United States that there's very little serious interdisciplinary studies going on. And I will talk about that. I'm delighted to be here. I was a visiting professor in Nanjing in China. They had really great staff, 19 scientists and 2 ethicists. Yeah, thank you.
Great. My name is Suzanne Anker, and I am an artist, so I live on the dark side. I also write. I have written a number of texts about the intersection between biology and the visual arts. In 2011, I started one of the first bioart laboratories in the United States, where art students use the tools of science to create art. My work is about genetics, climate change, toxicity, and the way the planet is being altered both through the post-industrial world as well as in the scientific laboratories. So our program brings together biology with technology, because technology and biology are really twins.
So the first set of questions that I want to pose to the panel has to do with your own. I want to sort of establish the narratives about climate change. What kind of a problem is it? How do we know? How do we begin to build solutions to those problems that has emerged from your own particular fields of study, recognizing that many of you have interdisciplinary kinds of backgrounds. So let's start by getting some narratives expressed. So Rishikesh, could you begin and tell us how sort of climate change is narrated in the field of IR, or international affairs, and how your own sort of take on that narration?
Yeah, great, thank you. I'll be pretty specific so that it's a bit tangible. And the example that I would like to focus on is around Chinese overseas financing. And for the longest period of time, there was a lot of attention on China's financing of coal-fired power plants, right? And so for those people who may not be familiar, there was a very big push, major movements that happened around limiting the use of public finance to support fossil fuels abroad from supplying countries. And China was seen as the last country standing in terms of supplying public finance to support the build out of coal. And so that's what a lot of the fixation really was on, right? That China may be doing things internally to reduce its own carbon emissions, but here it was encouraging other countries to do so by continuing to support the building out of coal-fired power plants. Now, all of that shifted when President Xi announced that China would stop doing so in September of 2020. And so all of a sudden we had this sort of a narrative shift, right? From we have to, China is here, out here supporting coal plants, to now what does that mean in terms of renewables? Right now, of course, it's not as simple as flicking a switch, going from gigantic coal-fired power plants to utility scale, as in grid-connected renewable energy. And so we've seen sort of this shift happen in terms of what does this mean, and by China limiting public finance in coal, what does that mean in terms of China's engagement with these countries in terms of very large scale sources. So that's sort of the first shift. The second shift, which I'll briefly mention here, is China, for a very good reason, was seen as, particularly in sort of juxtaposition to the more Western-backed multilateral institutions like the World Bank and so on. China was seen as a very easy, fast, expedient source for very large-scale infrastructure projects. And of course, the exact sort of how costly these loans were was a consideration, but was not always the biggest factor, right? And so what we have right now is many countries entering debt distress. Not all of them necessarily have China as their biggest creditor country, but you really have a situation, a narrative shift, right? From we really have to get the cost of solar down, the cost of wind down, to these countries are in debt distress. And if you can barely keep the lights on, what does that mean, right, for investing in renewable energy in these countries? And so we've sort of seen a shift away from more project specific, how can we bend the cost curve down for very specific technologies, to these countries are in debt distress. And how do we really resolve the macroeconomic constraints that these countries face, especially in light of things like, for example, with the Federal Reserve here hiking up interest rates for a good reason to dampen down inflation, that obviously has ripple effects around the world. And so there are these macroeconomic constraints that countries face, right? But the big shift that's happened over the last decade or so is this focus that was largely on individual cost-specific sort of aspects to what really is the financial and macroeconomic health of the country, and how can you really accelerate climate action when you are so severely constrained by the macroeconomic constraints. So that's sort of the second shift that is very visible from the so I'll pause there.
Okay, great, thanks. Let me just pose a question to you. Are there counter narratives that are swirling around your sort of area of work that I'm thinking specifically in context of sort of the global sort of shift towards authoritarianism in some parts of the world, the war in Ukraine, the militarization of geopolitics that we've been seeing, and maybe from some other sort of origin space. Are there counter narratives that you're encountering in your field?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think something important to highlight, I think, for this group is that before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right, the discussion was very much on how can you limit public finance, not just towards coal, but also towards natural gas. And but because of the invasion, the discourse really shifted to one of energy security, at least in the short term, to medium term, rather than climate change, right? So we've really seen that really take place. And what that's happened is the very big sort of ethical question at that time was, should African countries that on a per capita basis have such low levels of emissions, should they receive public finance to support the extraction of natural gas or not, right? That was the big ethical quandary. And but however, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've really seen that turn upside down, where how can the Europeans now go to Africa, right, and say you can't be doing this when in fact they've gone there. And for example, in Egypt, where which hosted the last COP, for example, and they signed an export agreement on natural gas, right? So you've really seen this. It's kind of a counter narrative, but it also really muddies the waters in terms of the cleanness and the clarity in terms of this is sort of a unidirectional shift away from fossil fuels, which really was the emphasis, is now all of a sudden muddied because now there's energy security concerns, and particularly for Europeans, even progressive Europeans, who really wanted to see the shift happen. And so I think we've seen that really these sort of geopolitical events really overtake and hijack some of the clarity that people really sought in terms of a smooth transition to a low carbon future.
It's a little depressing. I appreciate the extra perspective. And talk a little bit about the sort of narratives of climate change that emerge out of critical media studies and your take on that.
Yeah. So just to sort of extend also on some discussion in terms of the counter narratives and this, focus on security too and safety, and seeing that as also a response from the pandemic too. And so even thinking about US contexts, and so in climate media studies, really taking a look at how different actors and stakeholders are represented in various media and discourses, and seeing how climate justice activists recently are being portrayed as threatening. So threatening to security, national stability, threatening a movement towards, reestablishing, again, a national sense of stability. And also in the post-Trump years too, just to draw in some US context too, it's been circulating a lot in terms of needing to find and reclaim a sense of national identity and, again, the safety and stability. And so certain perspectives that are determined to be threatening to that across various mainstream media outlets are often portrayed as out of step or out of line, or again, threatening to this recovery process. And so you see, for example, recently in discussions where there's critiques launched against some climate policies or decisions that are lacking in terms of thinking about justice perspectives, or thinking about how there are still certain marginalized communities that are excluded from decision-making processes. And when activists draw attention to this, are portrayed as, again, out of step, out of line, and in some way threatening this march towards a more secure future. And so that's just something I want to add on, where there is, this increase in recent years, this sense of security and how that plays out in different national contexts, and this movement towards authoritarianism, and how media are actually in some ways contributing to this sense of there needing to be this reclamation of normalcy, and how certain actors and activists are sometimes represented in ways that are positioned as, again, in a threatening, fear-mongering way. So in communication and critical media studies, for a really long time, there was a lot of concern about narratives around how to get people to be concerned about climate change. So for a very long time, how can people, it's an urgent problem. And so how can we get people to really understand that and support change? And now it's less of a question of how to get people to be concerned, because people are concerned. So across the board, in polling done across national contexts, there is a large majority concern about climate change. So now the question for communication is, again, kind of thinking about, what you're talking about too, in terms of how to define the problem. So how is climate change defined? What is identified as the causes of climate change? Who is given the authority to determine what are considered the most pressing challenges or contours of climate change? In that way, who is positioned as legitimate in terms of designing responses to climate change? And so from my field, thinking critically in terms of, thinking through, for example, how defining climate change in ways that are all-encompassing or apocalyptic scenarios that really don't do a lot in terms of giving context for the root causes. So histories of capitalism, histories of colonialism, and thinking through that in terms of also in specific places, how climate change impacts people differently, and how there's different movements towards thinking how to respond differently, organize societies differently. And so, how in media, if it's just an all-encompassing apocalyptic representation, these really nuances are sidestepped. And there's a movement away from identifying different specific ways of defining the problem, and then again, positioning a variety of people to contribute responses. And also one thing in my field that is presented as a problem and that we're grappling with is thinking too about, again, if climate change is not understood and defined historically and with specificity and with nuance, then it could lead to possibly all-encompassing solutions like technological fixes opposed to changing political structures, moving towards large-scale geoengineering projects instead of really moving towards accountability in terms of changing, again, policies and decision-making processes that include more people and that really get at the crux and the root of what is propelling the climate crisis. So I will stop there and pass it on, but just in terms of, again, thinking about how climate change is represented as a problem, and that way, who is then positioned and what is positioned as the right way or legitimate way of responding, and thinking through that critically.
Thanks. Before you pass it on,
Yeah.
I'm not going to promise to ask everybody follow-up questions, but it occurs to me that, communication studies and media studies, if I understand it correctly, is in the business of studying narrative.
Mhm.
So in a way, I wonder if you can just reflect a little more for us on the sort of maybe the advantageous position of your field for addressing these very issues, because it seems to me like folks in your field, yourself included, are especially well equipped and prepared to study the dynamics of narrative.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, because for a long time, communication, the field was seen as sort of, not really. I always got the question of, oh, did you broadcast journalism? It's like, I don't. Why do you think that? No, it's studying how discourses form, narratives form. So narratives, you're thinking about, this elements of a story too. So how climate change as a story is told through various mediums. So thinking about journalism or thinking about film. I'm really interested in the interaction and thinking about discourse in terms of the interaction between different forms of knowledge and different ways of seeing. And you're not just written textual, but really getting at, we can probably talk about the art, really thinking about and engaging with different ways of representing, understanding, seeing climate change that really can get at what it actually is, instead of it just being limited to, again, apocalyptic narratives or too scientific in terms of it really losing the social, historical, cultural contexts that are at the crux of the crisis and necessary for thinking about responding. So yeah, communication is a really interesting field because it really means so much and it's super interdisciplinary, and it draws upon a lot of fields. And I'm in the School of the Environment, which is an environmental studies school essentially, but just brings people from chemistry to political science to sociology. I'm the only communication person, but there's so much. There's a lot of interesting movements happening where there's a lot more consideration of the field of communication that wasn't considered before. So I feel lucky that I'm being included in conversations more and more. But yeah, communication is super important for thinking about, again, ways of seeing in addition to also ways of speaking or talking and writing about climate change.
Yeah, I think it's become increasingly clear to people as we've dealt with 20 years of climate denialism that the science is important, but so is the messages that get delivered and how they get delivered and who funds those messages.
Yeah, that's a good point too. The political economy side of communication is really crucial too.
Exactly. Can you say a little bit about your field and the narrative that emerges from legal and ethical studies?
Well, so I was a negotiator for the Clinton administration in 1997, when every country in the world agreed that climate change was human caused, while at the same time, the United States was being captured by the narrative of the fossil fuel. The disinformation campaign is so evil. The problem is it worked. Okay, most of American citizens aren't. I'm just blown away that they don't know that climate change is serious. Okay, we're doing something terribly wrong to try to correct the narrative, and the United States possibly will fix that. Okay, so when I go around the world, people say, what happened to your country? Okay. I wrote a book, Who Shot Rachel Carson? Okay. So I was right in the middle of the beginning of the disinformation campaign. It didn't start with climate change. It started with something called the Powell Memo, okay? And billions of dollars to get Americans to believe that government isn't good for anything. The free market has taken over everything. We need the economists to see the ethical issues. And as people in this institution will say, they won't. They will not look, they will not join their technical discipline to integrate ethics in it. So the United States, unfortunately, all my colleagues believed after Paris, we got to go to zero carbon. Okay. And UNEP said that. When I talked about going to zero carbon, the academics said, we're not going to talk that way, okay, about it. So I'm seriously criticizing the United States. It is possible, if people understand what's going on, that we could correct this. We do have some good people. So right now in the United States, in the US Congress, there's 132 congressmen that are still climate deniers. And the state is equally as important as the federal government in terms of reducing carbon. And in the state of Pennsylvania, most of the people are climate deniers. So the fossil fuel industry has maneuvered to get their people in the legislature. Okay, so the narrative is really important. We got to change the narrative, and the narrative that in itself is an amazing problem. For 20 years, it was how much time left do we have to get to 2 degrees centigrade? That's an issue, but that's the Army War College, to its credit, in 1997 said we're going to have hundreds of millions of refugees in the United States, but it's focusing on the 2 degrees centigrade doesn't tell you what you have to do, because it's the atmospheric concentration, which is directly risen by emissions, and the academics aren't talking about it. Okay, so we have a serious communications problem, a serious intellectual problem. I'm friends with Michael Mann, who formed the narrative on the 2 degrees centigrade, but it's the atmospheric concentration. And here's the other thing. Greenhouse gases are not like air pollution. Greenhouse gases go up in the atmosphere and they 20% are removed in 100 years, but most of them last for 10,000 years. Okay, how do you do a cost-benefit analysis on that? I'm looking. This is like a Monty Python. I'm looking for comedians to see the absurdity of what's going on. But most the disciplinary focus of the United States, which has done some really good thing. This is a deeply and you don't get it till you see the interdisciplinary aspects of this. So we have a problem, and Biden just agreed to expand. He must not understand. Okay, people in the United States, I'm shocked how people with PhDs don't know how serious the problem is. So we have to form another narrative using the press to help people see the other narrative, I think is the major challenge. Anyone that's been close to us knows that the hope is to get everyone in the next COP to commit to an enforceable zero target. And there are some good people doing that, but quite frankly, the academics don't get it because it's a deeply interdisciplinary problem. It's not like air pollution at all. The problems that we solve. I have some friends at the New York Times who are going to help me do this. Okay, so there's never been a metric in the United States about, like in COVID, they had a curve and you could see how we're doing. Okay, that's never appeared in climate change. So we have a lot of work to try to change the narrative. The media it has to be part of the solution, and I've hope that we can do it. You know, the United States got in the 1970s, people liked the United States because it solved justice problems, it solved narrative problems. So people call me Don Quixote because I think there's an amazing couple of books out by Senator Whitehouse. Is that people know what he's doing the right thing? Okay, the right thing is not only to change the narrative, but it's because it's a democracy problem to get people to understand who's screwing them and how they did it. And Whitehouse is an amazingly exactly what we need. So if you go into the Pennsylvania legislature, there's a hearing coming up, and they're still bringing the skeptics in who have never peer reviewed anything. You know, we have a very, very serious problem. We have to figure out how to get Americans to, first of all, understand how serious it is, okay, and to understand that the Paris Agreement narrative is actually deflective of you got to go to zero, not only for the Paris Agreement, but to prevent the atmospheric concentrations going up, which is causing all the refugee problems. So the other thing is, I can't believe this is happening. Corporations are shutting down liberal arts schools. I can't believe they're doing that. Okay. It's really, really evil what they're doing. One of my favorite intellectuals is Hannah Arendt. Okay, Hannah Arendt said, whenever anyone's power is threatened, they will lie. Okay, and that's what's happened in the United States. And really good people, I mean, environmental people, they don't understand how this is different. Okay, so I'm working with Senator Whitehouse. He's like doing the exact. He said, "Don't talk about the facts. Help people. This is a democracy problem, okay? And you got it. People will be energized if they see who's causing the problem. They will. That's where my hope is, okay? So I think America is capable of producing a Senator Whitehouse, and there are other legislators that are doing that, but unfortunately, we have a long way to go, a really long way to go. And but one of the refrains in America the Beautiful is something like correct your evil ways. Okay, you have a duty to the rest of the world to do it. So because it's atmospheric, a lot of people are talking about the ethics issues in climate change, but they don't. I've worked on climate ethics. I got an award from UNESCO. Just let me finish one. In the treaty, there were 4 ethical rules that were agreed to: equity, no harm, and they got no traction in the United States. Okay, no one that I know of. I helped write for IPCC the equity section, which is a list of 4 or 5 things it can be. But none of the academics came close. The Europeans did better in defining what equity is than the United States. So unfortunately, the founding fathers of the United States said, you better watch out that the rich people don't take over the democracies. Okay, and so that's where we are. My job is to tell the truth as I see it. Okay, and I have friends that are willing to work with me on that. So I'm posting on my website, Ethics in Climate, 6 or 7 things that the press has got to start covering, because we need a metric to see whether we're making progress. So when Biden, as he just did, allowed for a large drilling that will add to the carbon, someone on his team doesn't understand the problem. I don't think it's evil. I think the disinformation campaign has taken over, and it's a narrative problem. And that's what they were trying to do. There's something called the Powell memo. 1971. The Powell Memo, the purpose of the Powell Memo was to get Americans to believe that government's not good for anything, only the private market. And what they did, I couldn't believe that they were doing what they're, but they were successful. So a lot of the people from the Chamber of Commerce, they really do believe that the market is the only solution. And it got worse when the neoliberalism started, and Clinton was a neoliberal. How do I know it? People start screaming at us at the United Nations, which United Nations is a culture of extraordinary politeness. And in 1997, they all start screaming at us, what's the matter with you? We are the delegation, what the hell is Gore? Why are we doing this, So anyway.
Thank you, thanks. Suzanne, what is the art world doing about climate change, or rather, how is the art world shaping narratives about climate?
I think it's very important to look at the role of art in any society because it represents the cultural imaginary. So things that can't be expressed in other ways can be expressed through pictures or films or plays, etc. And the arts have always looked towards its own history as a way to create a data bank of images that represent the cultural imaginaries of other times. And we see climate change, paintings of climate change, paintings of plagues, etc., throughout art history. And I'll take up Rachel Carson now, because when her book came out, The Silent Spring, she was ridiculed by the Senate because she didn't have a PhD. And she was writing about the fact that next spring is going to be silent because the eggshells of robins are too thin to hatch. Eventually, she became a hero. But the other impact that she had was on art. And this was a time that artists were interested now in moving into land art, which could be a reclamation of mining zones or of explaining the ecology between species. And it also brought about video art, which was the technology that could broadcast essentially many of the messages of what's happening in the landscape. But more currently, artists are actually engaged in helping to deter the amount of waste that takes place because of international biennials and different kinds of art fairs. And there's a new artist site called Artists Commit. And it was put together, it's a collective, it was put together by an artist in which they now decode the amount of the carbon footprint of an exhibition. So some of the galleries are involved in that, others are not. Many galleries throw away frames or throw away crates or throw away bubble wrap when it could be repurposed in many ways. Sometimes there are too many flights involved for visitors or even artists sort of lecturing around the world. I also think that there are exhibitions that artists do to visualize some of the detriments of climate change. There's one photographer who went around to some of the islands where the albatross birds actually hatch and showed the inside of these birds filled with plastic. And this is true for many other species in this sense. Also working with a young woman here who's very concerned about the abandonment of
canvases in art schools after the semester is over. So she's decided that she was going to work with 26 other art schools and come up with an exhibition called Tale of the Exiled, Salvaged Works from Art School Waste. So I think this is also very, very interesting. There's also in New York, we have a Materials for the Arts program where industry can donate different forms of possible art materials and people can come and use that. And in my lab, we did a very interesting project called the Mayo Tomato. And it was a speculative project, but it had scientific stability to it. We did it in 2016 as part of the BioArt Challenge. And in that, what we did is we genetically altered a tomato with myoglobin, which is similar to hemoglobin, so that the tomato itself would produce proteins and eliminate the cows and the cow burps, etc. Since we're artists, we only could take it so far. We did get on electrophoresis print out the fact that the myoglobin gene was actually in the tomato, and therefore, rather than needing a lot of fancy equipment, this is before the Impossible Burger and all of that, which has as many calories as beef anyway, is that people in poorer countries could plant seeds and essentially have enough protein in their diet. So artists are engaged in this because many of my students, it's their generation, okay? We are leaving behind a big mess for them to clean up. Another course that we started was called Trash. And in that class, students were not allowed to buy any art materials. They had to just find materials for their projects and reuse them. So I think there are things that education can do, as well as the art world, in order to have this social dialogue.
Can I just say one thing about that? We need John Oliver on this. Comedy can show absurdity incredibly well. There's so many. I actually am crying out, John Oliver, we need you. So I have a master's degree in philosophy and art, and both narrative and poetry, but also comedy can be an incredible truth teller. This stuff is so absurd, that I actually think John Oliver could help.
I agree with you. I think that's the arts are part of a knowledge producing entity. It is not just, a painting hanging over your couch, okay? Art has the ability to critique, to create irony, and to sort of tell it like it is, because it's a renegade practice. So
Can I just say one thing? Okay. I was at, John Broome was talking about, how do I put a price if climate change kills everybody? What's the price? Okay. And I thought that was a Monty Python moment. No.
So I want to follow up, Suzanne, with a question about getting back to kind of the interdisciplinary nature of our collective work here. And it strikes me that art is an important medium for communicating climate change, but also for integrating the science and translating the science in a way that people who are not experts in climate science can better understand. Can you speak a little bit about whether from your work or others, about the sort of changing relationship between artists and scientists.
Interesting.
Well, this has been a growing field for the last 25 years, and these collaborations are existing worldwide now with many exhibitions. The Kappa and Cube in Beijing just had their art and technology biennial called Synthetic Ecology. And I think that that brought a lot of attention to the subject. I was also contacted by a company called Movie, MOOVI, that wanted to produce derivatives of some of my work and turn them into frisbees. And the frisbees would be made out of coffee grinds and potato peels and almond shells. So they would be ecologically sound. So I think as more companies also turn towards this and not sort of climate change greenwashing, but actually creating new materials. And I was going to talk about that a little later. I think that art plays a significant role because when you see a picture of something, you can be elated or horrified. And that kind of emotional connection is something that happens immediately.
Going back to you, Rishikesh, I'm wondering about the sort of, if you could tell us a little bit about some of the dominant actors and processes in the field of international climate finance and affairs. I'm thinking about the COPs and the role of those events in shaping our narratives about climate change and climate solutions, and what do we gain from those narratives, and what do we give up in the process of the media attention that those events get every few years? It seems to me, just being a sort of a bystander watching the reports coming out of the COPs, is that there's what's become a fairly predictable pattern of excitement that sort of bleeds into concern and fear and then disappointment. So there's this kind of narrative arc that seems to repeat itself every few years. And I'm wondering, for your perspective, just about the sort of the narrative quality of these events, these conferences, and whether they're serving their purpose. Don, could you pass? Thanks.
Thank you. That's a great question. So just as background very briefly, right, just so that everybody's on the same page, when we say the COP, we mean the Conference of the Parties to a particular treaty, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is sort of the mothership. And the understanding was that as time evolves, we would negotiate far more specific legal instruments that would help implement various aspects of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, right? So it was deliberately set up as a treaty process that would yield more precise and specific protocols or other instruments. The Kyoto Protocol being one example, the Paris Agreement being another example. And so every year around November or December, there's this big gathering, and there's a lot of attention that these COPs get. I think to answer your question, I think something that we have to understand is that these COPs are actually, they operate very much by mandate right now. I think from a narrative perspective, you can't deliver a Paris Agreement every year, right? Those are very few breakthrough moments that actually happen. And one unfortunate thing that's happened is that people expect that kind of a breakthrough at every single COP, which by mandate, it's not possible because countries did not agree to come up with a brand new treaty every single year, right? So you can't expect every single COP to yield a major breakthrough. And so sometimes what happens is there is a misalignment between what the process is actually set up to do, what it's legally equipped to do, versus what people want that process to deliver. And so I think that wedge between public expectation versus the legal mandate is something to pay attention to. But what I worry is that that's actually deeply damaging to the credibility of the process if that persists for a very long period of time, right? Because if there isn't progress, then the UN process itself sort of starts to seem, like a process that's really not able to deliver on this. And so, having thought about this, and I know, we have experts who have thought about this for a very long period of time, but I think from my sort of analysis, I think there's two aspects that are, I think, particularly noteworthy around the COPs, right? One is it really puts countries in the driver's seat, right? So even though this is an international process, we can't forget that it's up to the countries, right, to come up with what their actual targets are. And so even though there is this, elaborate international thing, the core of the action really is with national governments. And so I think that's one thing we also have to understand is, yes, you can hope to influence the international process, but if what's really driving it is the actual national, building blocks, then you really need to be paying far more attention to how do you get governments to accelerate and therefore, catalyze the UN process rather than hoping it to be the other way around as well. Now, I think the second piece, which I sort of wanted to mention, is there's, I think the benefit of the COPs has been that there's spotlight right on climate change every single year. And I think those of us who have been following this for a long period of time know that how hard it was to actually get people to worry about climate change. And now, there's, it's almost a given around, the end of the year, there's this, a lot of, media attention on this issue. But I think just to sort of wrap up sort of my brief statement here, I think we really have to understand what can this process actually do. And if we don't fully understand that, then I think we're just risking of putting ourselves in a position where we demand too much from it without empowering it to actually do what we need it to do. Because it's governments, right, who decided which parts of the Paris Agreement were legally binding and which parts weren't. And so if you don't come up with a process, then you can't really expect it to deliver solutions that you haven't empowered it to deliver in the first place, right? So I think we really need to sort of have a very clear-eyed understanding, what can the Paris process do, and what do we need national governments to do, and what do we need the rest of society to do? So I think we really have to think in terms of these various distinct pieces. I'll pause there.
Thank you. And that's a great segue into my next question for Hanna, which has to do with the role of social movements and sort of more grassroots, deeper democratic kind of bottom-up change. And I know that this is something you study, including the roles of social media and digital media in fomenting pressures, upward pressures on governments and international organizations and processes like the COPs. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. And, it's interesting too, thinking about art too, and the role that art and activists together for providing this really powerful counter vision of what a possible future could look like. And so this is very powerful, especially in the climate movement of, providing, just asking and providing a space for how the future could look different and building material strategies for how to get there and building alliances and coalitions around imagining how the future could be different. So in that way, imagining, contesting apocalyptic images of a world on fire and thinking differently about how, instead of circulating the possible scenario of an apocalypse, really thinking about the possibility of there being, just a different way of structuring society and of economies that isn't even a possible imagining. So thinking about, for example, the real power of the Green New Deal and how that provided this really tangible, material, economic alternative. And the Emmy award-winning video with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and produced by Naomi Klein and Avi Lewis with Intercept called "A Message from the Future." And this video was very powerful, went viral, and it showed, what would the future look like if we implemented these policies. And we have the coalitions, we have the people, we have the concern. So how can we do this and see what it would look like? And there are a lot of challenges in terms of right now what are understood as chilling effects. So chilling effects on democracy. And we see this in terms of various strategies to sort of quell collective action and collective ties. And you see this happening in the US and other countries, thinking about China too, and thinking beyond just, in terms of thinking through censorship of social movements and social media and the use of social media to build collectives in China, for example, and a lot of scholarship looking at how actually what's censored is not necessarily the critiques of being launched by activists, but if there's tangible plans for groups organizing. So before the pandemic, but now pandemic challenging even more the possibility of forming collective ties and these social ties. And what's censored on social media and removed, again, are plans to organize in groups and to provide these spaces for having social ties, collectives that can do the really important work of imagining how things could be different. And also thinking beyond the idea of there's an inevitable end. So resisting urges to say, well, inevitably people won't care, inevitably governments will fail, inevitably, really challenging that and seeing how that's actually a chilling effect on democracy too. And saying, actually majority of people do care, but interestingly and tellingly, in surveys being done, really important surveys being done by the Yale program on climate change communication, for example, which are showing that the vast majority of people are not only concerned about climate change, but also want to do something about climate change and also center justice in their visions for how to do something about climate change. But these same surveys show that people don't think that others share their perspective. And so there's this breakdown in terms of people, these social ties, this communication among communities, where there are shared concerns, there are shared desires for things being different, but it's not known that others feel that way. And so that is what, thinking about chilling effects on democracy and thinking about how these are strategies to really divide people and in ways that prevent and make it seem like it's impossible for things to be different when actually, there's the vast majority of people that want to have something different. So I think social movements are really powerful as art and, really powerful places, and educational institutions are really powerful places to, provide an avenue for understanding this and providing a route for critique, but also generating spaces for creative alternatives and imagining futures differently. And how it's not just a kind of, just cloudy or hazy image or, just something that isn't tangible, but there's really material plans and visions for how to get to a different economic, a different political structure of, so that actually there could be accountability for nations going into COPs, for example, and, just thinking how things could be really different. So it's really interesting seeing how this work is being done. There are really powerful, really important work coming out of social movements. And so thinking about interdisciplinarity too, but also thinking about how academics really take more seriously activist work, artist work, and thinking about coalition building too. So in addition to interdisciplinarity, thinking about coalitions and coalition building as, thinking about the important need to engage in politics too, and not just staying in an academic circle.
So that's great. Thank you. I want to sort of keep this, we're kind of moving into a space where we're talking about interdisciplinary the integration of different perspectives. And I'll come back to you, Don, in a sec, but Suzanne, I wanted to ask you about your own work with biomaterials. Tell us what those are, how that relates to climate change, and what you're, how you're incorporating waste and other things into your work, and the impacts that you think it's having.
Great. Well, there's great interest in biomaterials right now with many startup companies. In fact, today,
Maybe talk about what they are.
Yes, I will. Even today in the New York Times, seaweed has now been located as a possible even food source for cows, etc., or an edible plastic material. What we do in my lab is we work with bioplastics, which are essentially a combination of oils or fats and starches, and can be biodegradable and put back into the earth. So that's one thing. We also work with mycelium, which is a sort of the internet string of mushrooms that's underground. And mycelium, when you use it as a growth material, it is now being used as a substitute for styrofoam, which again can be put back into the earth. Also, I just want to mention that the climate change issue needs to be brought to the individual's notion of how it affects them. Okay, and this is where food comes in, because many of the food sources that we take for granted may disappear due to the colony collapse of bees or other pollinators. And there have been exhibitions about that as well. The idea that strawberries now grow in Greenland is something we need to consider as the heat kind of moves up. Another thing that is important for artists is that in teaming up with scientists, and there are many programs in Europe that invite artists to come in as a resident, because the artist is like a canary in the mine, that they're going to do things that the scientists either are not funded for or wouldn't think of, because artists break the rules. So there is one artist I'm going to mention named Mark Dion, who got a commission in London from the Science Museum. And the scientists there were very upset that they gave all this money to an artist to set up an installation. But one of his methods was he rented a car and he put fly paper on top of the car. He had a couple of his friends in the back seat holding out butterfly nets to capture some insects. And then everything was sent to the lab, and he discovered 3 species that were never thought to ever be in London. Okay. After that, the scientists were very happy that he was joining them in this endeavor. So the artist in the lab is, again, someone who will think of something that is doesn't follow the rules, but may in fact discover something, because science and art both rely on the recognition of accident. And I can cite many examples in science where that is the case. So food supply is tied into this, and that affects everyone, because everyone needs to eat to live. Okay.
Thanks. Coming back to you, Dawn, and this is the last question before we'll open it up for a few minutes of questions from the audience. I'm something you said earlier about the scientists that don't listen to the ethicists or don't listen to and bring. So could you? I'm interested in your sort of diagnosis of that problem and how it seems to me that if we're relying on science to produce the facts of climate change, we're relying heavily on engineers to develop technologies that are supposed to fix climate change. How do we bring ethics and philosophy into the picture at an earlier stage in the process, right? It seems to me like oftentimes the ethicists get involved at the end after it's too late, in effect, right? So do you have thoughts about what kinds of barriers have you or others in your field encountered in working with scientists to think about sort of the ethical implications of that work at an earlier stage in the process?
Yeah, it's an excellent problem. There are several sociologists in this school that said that if you ask scientists to work with ethicists, they will be traumatized. And I thought, that can't be true, but I've seen it, okay? And the explanation goes back to Hanna, I think. Anyone whose power is threatened, they will get upset. And often lie, they will tell the lies. And so I ran a consortium of 46 schools and trying to get the scientists to integrate ethics, and they wouldn't do it. So I'm not so sure I fully understand it, but sociologists here predicted it. I think it is most of these, even Michael Mann, who is a good friend of mine, he wouldn't do it either. When I found out that some of the tipping points were not in the IPCC models, I said, Michael, why? Well, to do a risk assessment, you have to base it upon observation, and they couldn't see it. Okay. And I said, the precautionary principle requires you to do precautionary science. And Americans don't know that. It's really, if you're an environmental lawyer, you often come up against problems you can't quantify. And the law actually didn't require you to have 95% confidence levels. So that's working just on the precautionary principle. But going back to what I would do, most of us are talking about what do we try to get, what's the outcome of the COP that we hope. And most of us think we got to get all countries to commit to net zero. We're really running out of time. And I'll just tell you, getting back to humor, I love Greta Thunberg. Okay. And the reason why I love it is because there's a science called rhetoric. And I always screwed it up. Aristotle said ethos, pathos, and logos. The job of rhetoric was actually a science designed to how to be effective in talking about injustice. And Aristotle said, you have to convince the people it's not about you. You're really upset by the injustice. And that's the ethos part. And you have to show the right amount of emotion. And then the important thing is the logos part, where you pick examples which are really clear that it's unjust. Okay. I have a friend who's got a PhD in rhetoric. He said, I've learned things about from Greta Thunberg. So I have, one of my hope is the young people, but the young people really should focus in on the most outrageous things that are going on and how people see the injustice, because it is, the sociologist said, the challenge is to get people so they'll join social movement. That's actually their words. Two sociologists here. I've learned more from the sociologists than any other discipline, because they think about how power works. Okay? And they say that in a democracy, you want to engage people in social movements, okay? Don't talk about facts, okay? And all the environmental people just talk about a fact, okay? And that may be perfectly appropriate for one moment in history, but when I got my award from UNESCO, they brought 10 Greta Thunbergs, who not only were like Greta Thunberg, they actually changed the law, okay? So whatever you do, the issue that you're focusing on should be a really good example of the injustice of it all. So that's where I would put my money.
Thank you. We're almost at time, but I want to give just an opportunity for a question or two from the audience quickly, if anybody has one. Yes.
I have a question. Thanks. My name's Susan Elliott, and I have a question maybe from some of the comments that Rishikesh said. And since this is a conference on China, I'm looking, if you look at the COP agreements, and how can we get US and China, perhaps the two largest economies in the world, to work together rather than be at odds on this really important issue? And it's not only COP, but even for Suzanne, you know, to change the narrative, the dialogue about this, that this is an area where our two countries could work together. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Thank you for that question. I think it's definitely an extremely important one in that prior to Paris, right, one big reason we saw the breakthrough in Paris was because of the agreement between the United States and China. But unfortunately, I think given the severe deterioration in ties and also the differences in perspectives in terms of at a broad level, right, I think the understanding is, can we somehow isolate climate change as an issue that both sides can agree on, is sort of one perspective where it has come to be seen as an American perspective, and the Chinese side being, well, everything should be considered together, right? That we can't simply isolate climate change as sort of one issue that should be immune to the rest of the matters that should be discussed in a bilateral relationship. And so I think we've, really seen those two diverging perspectives collide in terms of what really should be the role of climate change. And so unfortunately, we did see, some thawing in terms of at least at the technical level, the resumption in dialogue and exchange. But unfortunately, given the larger geopolitical, situation, I feel like that's sort of really seeped into the extent to which that collaboration can really happen. So I think, but hopefully as these sort of, technical dialogues resume, hopefully that at least, helps to keep something going. But I think, I wish I had a better answer for you, but I think it's sort of, largely a function of where the relationship stands with China.
I can add a little bit too, just in terms of thinking about the challenges of increased movement towards nationalistic narratives around climate change, and how that poses some real challenges in both the US and Chinese context in terms of, I've been chasing in US media and political discourse, in the past, especially since the Trump era, in the election in 2016, and in US media, really, again, I mentioned trying to reclaim an idea of what it is to be American and reclaim an American identity that was really shaken. And you see around climate change, interestingly, for the first time in 2019, there began a lot of coverage of climate change. Climate change just wasn't covered a lot before, like very minimal. And so in 2019, there was a real steep increase in coverage on climate change. But because this increase in coverage, which also is in response to the 2018 IPCC report, which really sparked a lot of widespread public concern and leading to these commitments among newsrooms to really cover climate change more seriously. But because it began in this era of trying to regain a sense of national identity and sort of a movement towards nationalism in a way, their climate change coverage and climate discourse is really in the US it's developed through this prism of what an exceptional US approach to climate change would look like. So Biden being framed, for example, when he was elected, as this route towards reclaiming American standing on the world stage and through climate change, being a climate leader, but again, through demonizing China in a lot of ways and positioning China as threatening to this vision for a US-led response to climate change. And so you see these nationalistic narratives, this enemy formation that's happening and in really counterproductive ways. And it's actually moving to, and what I'm looking in my work too, and I mentioned a little bit in terms of also it's leading to, again, a chilling effect on democracy in the US in some ways as well, because it's easy to position any sort of climate response. And we're seeing this now, again, with climate justice activists in particular being constructed as this unitary entity in a lot of media discourse and being positioned as, again, threatening to this national movement for the US to move forward on their vision for how to respond to climate change in a very particular way. And so it can actually be used to quell democratic responses within the nation, as well as coalitions between China and the US to really figure out how to grapple with climate change. So.
Great. Thank you so much for those responses, for the question. We're past time for the panel, so could you join me in thanking our panelists for